Hello everyone. Today's video should be much shorter and less philosophically dense than yesterday's because we are just going to be looking at the beginnings of the Reformation and Martin Luther. This is going to be a two-part video where the first is going to be released today and the second will be released on Monday. In today's video, we'll be looking at more of the history of how this starts, and in the second part, we'll be analyzing more of the theology of the Reformation. So by this point, everyone knows that the church needs reform, right? This is not a secret. The question is, what does this reform look like?
How can we protect ourselves? I got it! Let's all buy a Krabby Patty!
And it's very easy to say that Luther is the cause of the Reformation because
I threw it on the ground!
He is kind of the central figure of it. There's actually a bunch of other things that lead up to this that we've already talked about. The first was that Great Western Schism, because it's very obvious now that there's a bunch of corruption in the church. While this is happening, you see that rise of nationalism, and all these nations are replacing the church as the center of people's life. And so the church needs to reform how it interacts in this new nation-state world. Third is, with all this corruption, everyone's wanting to return to the Christianity of the Bible, because they look at the early church and they say it was so much simpler back then. The fourth is rejecting this idea of Pelagianism, which was an idea that Augustine fought against in the 4th and 5th century, that said, essentially, you can save yourself if you just do enough good things. Now, why is Pelagianism wrong? Well, Pelagianism completely ignores the fact that heaven is a relationship with God. This would be like being in a relationship with someone where all they did was do nice things for you, but they never actually talked to you. Right? No matter how many nice things they do for you, you still don't have an actual relationship with that person. And so while doing good things is good, it is not enough to have a relationship with God. Just as being nice to another person is a good thing, but just being nice to somebody doesn't mean that the two of you have a connection. And so this is where Pelagianism falls short. Further, we saw with the ontological gap that we've broken our relationship with God, and God is so radically other than us that the only connection we can have to him is through relationship. Right? So we can't reach back over this gap no matter how many good things we do. And I think it's just very obvious that, like, if heaven was about me being perfect my entire life and never making a mistake, I would be damned. And Pelagianism essentially said, if you ever make a mistake, you're damned. And the last thing about Pelagianism is, if Pelagianism is true and I can save myself by just being a good enough person, then there was absolutely no reason for Jesus to exist. And there's absolutely no reason for Jesus to die on the cross. Right? So Pelagianism, though it sounds good at first and we want to be like, yes, I can save myself, it actually completely gets rid of the cross and the reason for the incarnation. Plus, practically, if going to heaven was just about me doing good works, anyone who is truly honest with themselves knows that they would be damned. And St. Paul has this beautiful line where he's talking about the human condition, and he says, "What I do not understand, for I do not do what I want, but I always do what I hate." That we're these strange creatures that we all want to do the good, but for some reason, we never seem to be able to do it, or never be able to do it consistently. And so very often, we do things that we look back on and say, why the heck did I do that? And why the heck do I always seem to do that? So it's pretty clear, just looking at the human condition, that if salvation was all about what we did, we would be in trouble. But the good news is that God became one of us to bridge that gap as one of us and to give us the grace to walk with him back over that gap. And so a bunch of people are perceiving that Pelagianism is coming back into the church at this point, and that people are thinking that if I just do good things, God will let me into heaven, even if I never once even talk to God and ignore him completely. Finally, you have nominalism, which is really starting to give people anxiety because everyone's really afraid of being damned. And they're worried that God is so transcendent that he might be completely unpredictable, that I have no way of ever knowing whether or not I'm saved. Is my relationship with God actually working? Nominalism would say you will never know. And so everyone is very anxious. All of this is just ready to boil over, and it happens with Martin Luther.
And threw it on the ground.
Now, background on Martin Luther is he is born in 1483 in the Holy Roman Empire, which is in modern-day Germany. And for reference, he is born only 60 years after the end of the Western Schism, where there were 3 people claiming to be Pope at once. To put this in perspective, this is the same distance between the end of World War II and when all of you students were born. So, as aware as we are of World War II, Luther was aware of this Western Schism. Well, Luther's in a decently wealthy family, and he's clearly very smart. Like, this guy is brilliant. And so they decided to send him to law school. One day Luther was traveling, and he is caught in a massive thunderstorm out in the middle of the woods. And he is afraid that he's going to die. Lightning is striking around him. And he promises to God that he will join the monastery if he survives this lightning storm. As we know, he does survive the lightning storm, and about 2 weeks later, he joins an Augustinian order and leaves law school. And there he becomes a priest and a professor of theology and scripture. While studying scripture, he takes a visit to Rome in 1510. And it is just absolutely corrupt. And he sees priests everywhere just doing completely scandalous and awful things. And he realizes the corruption of the church is not just something in the past, but it is still going on in Rome. So he decides to dedicate his life to reforming the church, and he returns back to his monastery. What is important to note about Luther is he has some extreme anxiety in what's known as scrupulosity, where he is so aware of his sinfulness. Luther loves Jesus, right? He loves God and he wants to be in this relationship with God, but he is so acutely aware of every single fault he has. And he knows how imperfect he is, and no matter how hard he tries to be a good person, he keeps failing. And so it's said that he went to confession multiple times a day, and that one time his priest told him that his penance is to not come back to confession for a week. But Luther is just so anxious because he's worried that, like, if I am constantly sinning, doesn't that mean my relationship with God is broken? And doesn't that mean I'm being sent to hell, despite how much I love God and want to be with him? And he starts to see himself as just getting in the way of himself everywhere. While this is happening, there is some corruption in the local church that Luther gets upset about.
You can't buy me, hot dog man.
And primarily, this is because of a man named Albrecht of Brandenburg. Now, at this time, Albrecht is only 23 years old and has already been promoted to a cardinal because his family is super rich. Obviously, his family probably bought him. And he's kind of a playboy who doesn't care about his people. So he starts to break all these different canon laws, and Rome catches wind of this, and Rome fines him for it heavily, because this guy has pretty much done nothing that a bishop should do. But Rome does allow him to raise money for it, and they allow him to give indulgences. Now, indulgences cannot be sold.
He is one for free.
But what Albrecht does is he hires Tetzel, the preacher, who goes around and starts preaching indulgences for the dead, which is new and has never been officially taught and is actually condemned. Now, what is an indulgence? An indulgence is the remission of a temporal punishment in purgatory for the sins you commit. right? Indulgences actually still exist in the Catholic Church, and they're a really good thing. The issue is there was corruption in which someone was selling indulgences. So I'm editing this section, and I realized that my explanation of indulgences after this isn't very good, and this really isn't the main point of this video. So if you're interested further in why indulgences are actually a good thing, I will link a video somewhere here. Yeah. Luther has an issue with this, and so, being a good priest, he writes Albrecht a very humble letter saying, look, I think there's an issue with this. We shouldn't be selling indulgences. For the dead, this won't work. You're just stealing people's money, and if anything, you're causing them to sin. Albrecht ignores this, and this leads to Luther's posting of the 95 Theses.
I ain't gonna be part of your system.
He nails his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Cathedral door on October 31st, 1517, and this is effectively the starting date of the Reformation. Now, this was not him condemning the church, but rather he just wanted to start an academic discussion about indulgences and other practices. But news of these 95 Theses spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire, and a lot of other restless Christians who are frustrated with the church and its corruption start to support Luther in his questioning of the church. Long story short, this leads to a big dispute between Luther and Albrecht, and the Holy Roman Emperor actually has to get involved in this. And because of the Holy Roman Emperor getting involved, now Rome has to get involved too.
Happy birthday to the ground! I threw the rest of the cake too!
So news of Luther and his theological disagreement has spread to Rome. But within the Holy Roman Empire, Luther has gained significant support, especially from a lot of the nobility, especially Luther's own lord, who wants Rome to get out of Germany, and he wants a lot of political power for himself. So many of these German lords and kings are siding with Luther, not so much theologically, but many of them politically. Now, of course, and a number of them do choose Luther theologically, but what I'm trying to point out is there's a heavy political entanglement with Luther from the beginning. Now, Luther himself is attacking the church theologically.
I threw it on the ground!
And he wants to argue matters of salvation, authority, and the role of the church, especially the role of the Pope, because clearly it's been abused. And Luther says it's about time we need to talk about this. Luther in his own mind thinks that if he has any part of his own salvation, he will just get it in his own way. And so he thinks the way that the church thinks about salvation is wrong and needs to change. Well, the Pope sends Luther a letter and essentially asks Luther to recant his writings. Luther refuses to recant and tells the Pope he will only recant if a council of bishops proves him wrong.
I'm not a part of your system!
Notice this is that conciliarism idea coming up. Luther doesn't think the Pope has the authority to prove him he's wrong. Luther looks back at the early church and says it is a council that makes the final decisions. Well, the Pope says, you're wrong, end of story. This is one of the biggest mistakes a Pope has ever made. Because some would argue that if the Pope had agreed to Luther and had a church council, that Luther may not have broken away from the church, and the Catholic Church would not be so divided today as it is. As much fun as it is to think about the what ifs, there's the reality of what happened. So the Pope does not call a council, and this kind of lets Luther loose in Europe.
Man, this ain't my dad. This is a cell phone.
So what we're going to do for homework this weekend is I'm going to have you read 2 excerpts from Luther's writings. These are both letters. One is a letter written to the German nobility in the Holy Roman Empire, and the other one's written to the Pope himself. And through this, we're going to be looking at the theology of Luther, and most importantly, look at Luther's conception of the church. And on the second part of this video, I'm going to be talking about more of Luther's actual theology and where he disagrees with the church and where he agrees.
You can't trust the system!
I hope this one was a little easier to grasp today, and I hope you're all doing well. And this is where I'm supposed to remind you all to like and subscribe. Stay healthy and stay holy, everyone.